They didn't just burn my firewood, they burned my lifeline. In the dead of Montana winter, with a storm rolling in and temperatures set to plunge below zero, the HOA decided my winter stockpile was too unsightly. So they destroyed it, just like that. No warning, no remorse. I stood in the ash of everything I'd spent months preparing, holding my daughter's hand, as she shivered inside a house growing colder by the hour. They called it a violation. I called it sabotage. And when they told me to keep quiet and play by their rules, I walked to the old hatch at the edge of my land, the one my grandfather built before any HOA ever existed, and I opened the spillway. Because some people only understand consequences when the flood finally reaches their doorstep. Winter in this corner of Montana doesn't arrive. It invades. It slams in like an armored column, no warning shots, no quarter given. By mid-October, the wind already carries the smell of iron and pine needles frozen mid-fall. The cold doesn't creep. It punches straight through wool and skin and bone until your thoughts themselves feel brittle. Out here, the mountains don't care how many tours you've done or how many medals they pinned on your chest. When the temperature drops hard enough, every man is just meat trying not to freeze. I learned that long before I ever bought this place. After 22 years of carrying a rifle for uncles who never learned my first name, I came home with a duffel, a medical discharge, and a daughter who needed somewhere the sky didn't explode at night. I found it in a narrow valley 30 minutes outside Helena, a patch of land pressed against a ridge so steep the sun gives up and goes home by 3 p.m. in December. The cabin was small, honest, built in the 60s by people who still believed a man ought to be able to see weather coming from his own porch. The deed was older still, inked in 1957, carrying a clause nobody had paid attention to in 3 generations, full ownership and maintenance rights to the emergency spillway and the manual gate that fed the reservoir above the neighborhood. My grandfather had poured the concrete himself. His handwriting was still scratched into the wet mix near the valve wheel J. Harlan, 57. I ran my thumb over those letters the day the realtor handed me the keys and felt something settle inside my chest that hadn't settled since Kandahar. I started preparing the way other men start gardens. August heat still shimmered off the gravel when I fired up the chainsaw and dropped the first stand of birch. The smell of fresh sap and 2-stroke exhaust hung thick while I bucked logs into rounds and split them with a 16-pound maul that sang every time it bit wood. By the end of the month, I had 4 cords stacked in perfect rows along the back fence walls of split maple and birch rising like ramparts. I built the shed with my own hands, 10 by 16 double-walled roof trusses, heavy enough to laugh at wet snow. Inside went the backup propane tank in a steel cage I welded myself, mouse-proof, bear-proof, idiot-proof. Pallets of canned goods lined the shelves in neat military rows. Chili beans, peaches, tuna-powdered eggs, anything that would sit for 5 years and still feed a growing girl. I added 50-pound sacks of rice, salt flour, oats, coffee. When the grid failed, and it always failed, we would not be the family eating wallpaper paste. My neighbors watched from their triple-pane windows and pretended they didn't see. Most of them had moved here for the view and the covenants, the promise that nothing would ever look unprepared. They paid other people to plow their driveways and trusted satellites to keep their heat pumps humming. A few waved when I hauled logs past their mailboxes. Most looked away. And then there was the HOA. The first time Karen Stratton rolled up my driveway, the afternoon light was the color of weak tea, and the air already carried the promise of snow. Her white Escalade gleamed like it had never seen mud. Vanity plate Ridge 1. Blonde bob sharp enough to cut glass sunglasses, reflecting my woodpile back at me like an accusation. She lowered the window exactly 4 inches, the official HOA greeting distance, and smiled with the confidence of a woman who had never once been told no and meant it. Mr. Harlan, she called, voice bright, and practiced the same tone officers use right before they explain why your leave is canceled. We've had several residents express concern about the volume of your outdoor storage. I leaned the splitting maul against the chopping block and wiped sawdust from my forearms. It's firewood, ma'am. Keeps my daughter from turning into an icicle when the power lines snap, which they do. Every single winter. Her smile stayed pinned in place, but the corners tightened the way a sniper's cheek welds to the stock. Of course, safety is everyone's priority. It's simply that the quantity appears to exceed the allowances outlined in our Visual Harmony and Architectural Standards Section 4C. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the wind to rattle the aspen leaves behind me. Section 4C, I repeated. The one that doesn't actually exist in the copy of the covenants I printed off the county website last week. A flicker, something between irritation and surprise, crossed her face before the mask slid back into place. We're updating the language this quarter. In the meantime, I'm sure you want to be a good neighbor. I looked past her at the perfect rows of split birch gleaming gold in the low sun, then back at her French manicure wrapped around a leather steering wheel cover. Ma'am, my daughter and I plan to be alive in February. That's the only kind of neighbor I'm interested in being. She blinked once slow. I'll leave the formal notice with you then. We do hope you'll reconsider before the matter has to escalate. The envelope appeared between two manicured fingers like a white flag in reverse. I took it without reading, folded it once, and tucked it into my back pocket the way I used to tuck frag orders I already knew were bullshit. Karen raised the window, executed a perfect three-point turn, and rolled away down the gravel without raising a single speck of dust. I watched the Escalade disappear around the bend, then turned back to the woodpile. 3 days later, the second notice arrived, this time taped to my front door in a plastic sleeve like a restaurant menu. Red border, bold capitals. Violation, immediate removal required. I photographed it, time-stamped it, filed it in the folder already growing fat on my desk. Then I went back outside and kept stacking, because winter was coming. And out here, winter doesn't care about your covenants, your committees, or your manicured fingernails. Winter only respects preparation. And I had no intention of meeting it empty-handed. The first real snow came the night Maggie turned 16. It started as a few lazy flakes drifting past the porch light, then thickened into a white curtain that swallowed sound itself. By midnight, the world outside was nothing but a soft, relentless roar. I stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee gone cold in my hand and watched the drifts climb the fence posts like slow-motion invaders. Maggie slept upstairs wrapped in the quilt her grandmother made the year before cancer took her. I could hear the faint whistle in her breathing through the old floorboards, nothing serious yet, just the dry air. But every whistle reminded me why the shed out back was more fortress than storage. The next morning, the county plow hadn't come within 5 miles of our road. The HOA had its own contractor, of course. Their orange trucks rumbled past the lower cul-de-sac, first blades throwing perfect arcs of snow onto lawns that would be green again by May. My driveway stayed virgin white. I fired up the old Ford chained up and carved my own path. When I came back, another glossy envelope waited under the wiper blade. Third notice. This one had color photos, my shed, my woodpile, my propane enclosure. Red circles drawn around each like targeting reticles. A new line had been added in bold. Failure to remedy within 72 hours will result in daily accruing fines and possible forced removal by authorized vendor. I carried it inside, laid it on the table next to the highlighted bylaws I'd printed at the library. No mention of firewood limits. No mention of propane enclosures. Only a vague sentence about preserving neighborhood aesthetics. I took a black Sharpie and drew a line through the word aesthetics, wrote above it in block letters, survival. Maggie came down in her pajamas, hair a wild halo, eyes still puffy from sleep. She saw the envelope and sighed the way only teenagers can sigh, half exasperation, half ancient weariness. They're not going to stop, are they? Not while Karen's breathing, I said. She poured herself cereal, then paused. Mrs. Delgado told Mom's old friend Lisa that Karen's husband lost a bundle in crypto last year. They need the HOA president title for the resume when they flip the big house in Phase 3. I raised an eyebrow. 16 years old and already better at intel than half the lieutenants I served with. That explains the desperation, I said. Doesn't excuse the crazy. Maggie crunched her cereal, thinking, what happens if we just ignore them? Then the fines stack up. They put a lien on the house. And eventually some judge who golfs with Karen's lawyer signs off on forced compliance. Happens all the time in places with stronger HOAs than ours. She looked out at the snow now glowing pink in the dawn. So we fight. We document, I corrected. Fighting comes later if it has to. That afternoon, I set up 2 trail cameras, one aimed at the shed, one at the porch, and ran the SD cards inside every night. I started a new folder on the laptop, HOA Evidence. 27 files already. I added number 28, a scanned copy of the third notice timestamped with a sticky note that read, "No such 72-hour clause exists in covenants." By the end of the week, the fines began. First email, 75. Second, 150 euro, escalated non-compliance. Third, 275, continued visual obstruction plus administrative processing. They came from a generic address admin@ridgeviewheightshoa.org with Karen's cursive electronic signature at the bottom like a royal seal. I printed every one 3-hole, punched them, slid them into the binder beside the bylaws. The total was already over $600 and climbing. Maggie watched me read the latest one and asked the question she'd been carrying for days. "Daddy, can they actually make us leave?" I set the paper down and looked her straight in the eye. "They can make noise. They can make paperwork. They can make our lives inconvenient as hell. But they cannot make us leave this house. This is ours. Paid for with blood and 22 years of sand in places sand was never meant to go, understand?" She nodded, but her eyes were older than 16. I pulled her into a hug that smelled of wood smoke and coffee. "We've survived worse than a woman with a clipboard and too much time." She laughed once, a small sound, then went quiet. "Because I need you to know," I said into her hair, "no matter what letters they tape to the door, no matter how many fines they dream up, this house stays warm and this table stays full. That's not negotiable." She squeezed me tighter. "Promise." Cross my heart and hope to freeze. That night, the temperature dropped to -12. The stove roared. The windows fogged and froze in fern patterns. I sat up late cleaning my grandfather's old Remington 700, oiling the bolt until it moved like water. Not because I expected to need it. Because the ritual calmed me the way some men pray. At 2:14 a.m., the motion alert chimed on my phone. I slipped on boots and coat, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped into air so cold it felt like inhaling broken glass. The porch camera showed nothing but swirling snow. The shed camera showed the same. False alarm, probably a pine marten. But I stood there anyway, staring at my fortress of wood and steel glowing under the security light, and felt the first real thread of rage coil low in my gut. They weren't just harassing me. They were threatening the one thing I had left that was truly mine, the ability to keep my daughter alive when the world turned hostile. I went back inside, poured 2 fingers of bourbon I'd been saving since my retirement ceremony, and raised the glass to the dark window. "To Karen Stratton," I whispered, "may you never learn the hard way what happens when you push a man who's already decided there's nothing left to lose." Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing tire tracks, footprints, property lines. Inside, the fire crackled and the binder grew thicker. Winter had only just begun, and I was just getting started. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday at 6 sharp in the faux log community center that smelled of lemon disinfectant and desperation. I shaved for the first time in 10 days, pressed my old dress blues until the creases could cut bread, and pinned every ribbon I still owned across the left breast. Not for vanity, for intimidation. There's something about a chest full of brass that makes civilians remember rank exists for a reason. Maggie watched me knot the tie in the hallway mirror. "You look like you're going to a court-martial, Dad." "Same difference," I said. She bit her lip. "Kick her ass." Language, young lady. But yes, that's the plan. The parking lot was half full of Suburbans and Teslas, wearing fresh snow like expensive hats. I walked in through the side door so no one could pretend they didn't see me coming. Every head turned anyway. The folding tables had been arranged in a neat little tribunal. Karen sat dead center, flanked by Jeff the treasurer, balding, nervous, sweating through his golf shirt, and Meredith, the landscape chair, red hair, redder temper lips pressed so thin they disappeared. Name placards, bottled waters, a pitcher of cucumber slices floating like tiny green rafts. The whole production screamed authority that had never been tested by anything heavier than a strongly worded email. Karen stood when I entered. The smile was back, but colder now, like frost on a window pane. "Mr. Harlan, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." I didn't sit. I placed my binder on the table with a soft, deliberate thud that sounded louder than it should have. "Actually, I requested this hearing. You just approved it, so I'll stand." Jeff cleared his throat. Meredith glared. Karen's smile twitched. "Very well," she said, sitting again. "We're here to address your ongoing violations of community aesthetic standards." I opened the binder. First page, color photos of my shed, Taken from 4 angles, timestamped. Second page, the HOA bylaws, printed from the county website, highlighted in 3 colors. Third page, screenshots of Ridgeview Heights' own promotional brochure from 2 years ago, featuring a smiling couple in front of a house with, surprise, a very visible, very large woodpile. I turned the brochure so they could all see it. Funny, I said. When you were trying to sell lots, this was rustic Montana charm. Now that I live here, it's a violation. Meredith started to speak. I raised one finger polite, but the same finger I once used to silence a room full of lieutenants. I'm not finished. I walked them through every letter, every fine, every made-up clause. I read aloud the section that actually existed. Article 6, Section D, did not exist. I projected the county's official copy on the wall with the little projector I borrowed from the high school AV club, Maggie's idea. The room got very quiet. When I finished, Karen's knuckles were white around her pen. Thank you for that presentation, she said. However, the board has decided that a compromise is in everyone's best interest. She slid a single sheet across the table. Compromise. I could keep half the firewood if I built an HOA-approved privacy fence around the remainder. Design plans to be submitted for review within 10 days. $250 administrative impact fee payable immediately. I looked at the paper, then at her. Let me make sure I understand, I said, voice calm enough to freeze water. You want me to spend thousands of dollars and several weeks of labor hiding perfectly legal firewood behind a wall you get to approve during the onset of winter because you don't like looking at my survival. Karen leaned forward. We're offering you a path forward, Mr. Harlan. I closed the binder. Go to hell, Karen. The room inhaled as one organism. I picked up my cover, turned on my heel, and walked out. The cold night air hit my face like a slap I welcomed. On my way across the parking lot, a young woman stepped out of the shadows beside the dumpsters. Early 30s, dark ponytail, paint-stained hoodie. She glanced over her shoulder like someone might be watching. You're not the only one, she whispered. I stopped. Come again. She hugged a manila folder to her chest. They fined me $600 for painting my porch coastal fog. Said it wasn't in the approved palette. Same exact paint is on Karen's own house. I've got photos. I handed her my card, simple white stock name and cell number only. Document everything, dates, amounts, emails. You're going to need a trail when this gets ugly. She took the card with shaking fingers. It's already ugly. Then make it uglier for them, I said. They only win if we stay quiet. She disappeared back into the dark. I stood there a moment longer, breath fogging under the security light, feeling the first real spark of something that wasn't rage. It was solidarity. And solidarity in a place like this is the most dangerous weapon of all. 2 nights after the hearing, the temperature dove to -22. The kind of cold that makes diesel gel and turns breath into needles. I was up at 3:07 a.m. because the stove had burned low and Maggie's cough had moved from her throat to her chest. I fed it the last 3 splits of pine, watched the flames climb, then stood at the window staring at the shed glowing under its single security bulb. The woodpile looked like gold bullion under fresh powder. My grandfather's voice drifted through my head the way it always did. When the night got too quiet, a man who can keep his family warm owns the winter sun. Everything else is noise. I was still standing there when the motion alert pinged. Porch camera empty, shed camera black. Someone had disabled it. I pulled on boots without lacing them, grabbed the mag light, and stepped outside. The air hit me so hard my eyes watered instantly. The snow was knee-deep and still falling in thick, deliberate sheets. I crossed the yard in a half-crouch, rifle slung but not raised yet. The shed door stood ajar. The smell hit me first, sharp chemical wrong. Then the heat. A dull orange glow licked up the back wall, curling over the tarps like hungry tongues. I yanked the door wide. Flames roared out, greedy for oxygen. The propane enclosure exploded with a flat, metallic crump that punched the breath from my lungs. I stumbled back as a wave of superheated air rolled over me, singeing eyebrows, blistering the hand that had reached for the handle. Maggie 911. She was already in the doorway, phone to her ear, voice steady the way I'd taught her. I grabbed the garden hose, twisted the spigot frozen solid. Useless. I beat at the flames with a shovel until the handle blistered my palms, but it was like spitting on a bonfire. By the time the volunteer fire crew arrived, sirens wailing across the valley like wounded animals, everything I had spent 4 months building was charcoal and twisted metal. The fire chief, Tom Griggs, old friend from high school, walked the perimeter with me at dawn. The snow around the shed was melted in a perfect circle, steam still rising from black skeletons of logs. He crouched near the propane cage, now a melted sculpture, and pointed to the burn pattern. "Started back here," he said quietly. "Accelerant. Gas can pour looks like. And your interior camera." Someone unscrewed the lens and sprayed it with black paint. Professional enough to be amateur. He didn't have to spell it out. We both knew. I thanked him, voice raw from smoke and rage, then went inside to review what the porch camera had caught. 2 figures. One waiting at the tree line engine, idling, headlights off. The second moving fast, hoodie gloves, face shadowed. A red plastic gas can glinted once under the porch light before disappearing around the corner. 23 seconds later, the first orange flicker appeared. The lookout tapped brake lights twice signal, then both vanished into the dark. Not enough for an arrest, enough for war. I forwarded the files to Ben Keating and Bozeman with a single line. They just declared it. Ben called back before noon. I could hear him pacing his office boots on hardwood. "Harlan, listen to me. They're trying to make you the crazy vet who snaps. Do not give them the headline. We document, we wait, we bury them in discovery when the time comes." Ben, they torched 6 months of my life, in winter, with my daughter asleep 50 yards away. A long silence. "I know," he said finally. "But right now, the only thing between you and a felony charge is restraint. Keep the cameras rolling. Add more. And whatever you do, do not touch that spillway yet. Yet." I hung up, walked to the gun safe, and took out my grandfather's topographic maps instead of the rifle. Spread them across the kitchen table like a battle plan. The reservoir sat above us like a loaded gun, ice-covered now, but the forecast was shifting. 3 feet of snow in the next 72 hours, then an unseasonal warm front the following week. Snowpack plus rapid melt equals pressure. Pressure needs somewhere to go. Down the original emergency channel. Straight through Phase 3, the brand new cul-de-sac Karen's investors had shoehorned into the floodplain last spring. I traced the blue line with my finger. The same line my grandfather had drawn in 1957, when the county begged him to take stewardship of the valve because no one else wanted the liability. The same line the HOA's engineers had quietly erased from their site plans. Maggie came in wrapped in 3 blankets, eyes red from crying she'd done in private. "They took our heat," she whispered. "No," I said, voice flat. "They took the easy heat. We still have options." She looked at the maps, then at me. The spillway. I didn't answer. Didn't have to. She reached across the table and put her small, cold hand over mine. "Do what you have to do, Dad. Just come back inside when it's over." I turned my hand over and squeezed once. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows like thrown gravel. Inside, the stove burned low, but the maps burned hotter. Winter had drawn first blood. My turn. The storm arrived exactly as predicted, 3 feet, in 72 hours, wind screaming down the ridge like artillery. Power flickered the first night, died the second, and never came back. By the third morning, the house sat at 41 degrees and falling. The last of the scorched scraps I'd salvaged from the shed burned away before dawn. Maggie's cough had turned wet and deep, the kind that rattles in the chest and keeps a father awake, counting seconds between each hack. I boiled snow on the camp stove for tea, wrapped her in every blanket we owned, plus my old Army Gore-Tex sleeping bag, and watched frost crawl across the inside of the windows like living crystal. The generator had coughed itself empty at 4:12 a.m. The needle on the propane tank for the kitchen range hovered just above E. I rationed 1 log every 4 hours, just enough to keep the living room above freezing. The rest of the house was a meat locker. At 10:07 a.m., I called the county emergency line. 16-year-old female, possible early hypothermia, no heat, no power, no wood. Need transport to the warming center. The dispatcher's voice was frayed from too many calls and not enough trucks. "Sir, are you inside Ridgeview Heights, Phase 1 or unincorporated county? Edge of 12C. My deed predates the HOA by 35 years. A pause, keyboard clacking. That zone is under private HOA road maintenance. Their plows haven't cleared the gates for county vehicles. I'm sorry. I can log it as priority, but..." I hung up before she finished the apology. I stood in the kitchen clutching the phone so hard the plastic creaked. Maggie watched from the couch, eyes too bright, cheeks flushed with fever. "They won't come," she said. "Not a question. Not through Karen's gates. She closed her eyes. Then we don't need gates. I looked at the manila envelope they'd left on the porch 3 days earlier. Final demand, legal action, threatened removal of unauthorized structures with or without cooperation. I smiled for the first time in a week. It felt like cracking ice. Exactly. At 11:43 a.m., I kissed Maggie's burning forehead, told her I'd be back in an hour, and stepped into the storm. The wind tried to shove me sideways the moment I opened the door. Snow had drifted to the eaves. I waded waist-deep in places, using the fence line as a guide. The world was white soundless, except for the howl and the crunch of my own boots. 37 minutes later, I reached the spillway hatch, a concrete box half buried under a dune of powder. I dug it out with my gloved hands until my fingers went numb, then brushed the last flakes from the rusted lid. The county seal was still intact. My key cut in 1957, carried on my dog tags, ever since Grandpa died, slid home with a soft click that sounded louder than gunfire in the stillness. I did not open it yet. I simply turned the wheel, one full rotation, felt the gears groan awake, under decades of ice, and listened to the faint, distant gurgle of water moving beneath the frozen surface of the reservoir. A promise. Then I locked it again, covered the hatch with snow, and marked the spot with a single broken aspen branch driven upright like a grave marker. On the hike back, I passed within sight of the lower development. Through the blowing snow, I could just make out the orange glow of portable generators and the yellow rectangles of lighted windows. Karen's people were warm. They had fuel trucks on retainer private plows, a catered warming tent set up in the cul-de-sac like a goddamn tailgate party. They thought they were safe inside their covenant walls. They were wrong. That night, the temperature bottomed out at -29. Maggie's fever spiked to 103.8. I packed snow around her neck and wrists, spooned lukewarm broth between cracked lips, and spoke to her in the same calm voice I once used to talk frightened privates through their first firefight. Stay with me, baby. Just a little longer. At 2:14 a.m., I heard an engine idle past the house, slow, deliberate. Headlights off. I parted the curtain an inch. Karen's white Escalade, caked in road grime, parked across the street. The driver's window cracked just enough for a plume of cigarette smoke to drift out. She sat there for 3 full minutes, engine running, watching my dark windows the way a sniper watches a doorway. I stepped onto the porch in nothing but long johns and boots, arms crossed, breath clouding in a slow, steady plume. The cold bit so hard it felt like fire, but I didn't move. After 30 seconds, the window rolled up. The SUV reversed tires spinning, then disappeared down the road. Message sent, message received. I went back inside, added the last sliver of charred pine to the stove, and sat on the floor beside the couch with Maggie's hand in mine. At 4:58 a.m., the National Weather Service updated the forecast on my phone. Winter storm warning extended, followed immediately by unseasonal warm front beginning Tuesday. Daytime highs 38 to 45 DGF. Rapid snowmelt and runoff expected. I looked at the spillway key hanging from a nail by the door, glinting in the ember light. Tuesday was 3 days away. 3 days for 36 inches of snow to turn into 36 million gallons of water, looking for the fastest way downhill. And the fastest way downhill ran straight through 15 illegally built homes and one woman who thought rules were something she wrote on pretty stationery. I kissed Maggie's fingers, tucked the blankets tighter around her shoulders, and whispered the first honest prayer I'd said since Baghdad. Let it be enough. Outside, the storm kept raging. Inside, the clock kept ticking. And somewhere high above us, under a thickening lid of ice, the reservoir waited for permission to remember where it was always meant to go. Dawn after the third night of the storm broke pale and exhausted. The wind had finally died, leaving the valley under a silence so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. The house hovered at 39 degrees. Maggie's fever had broken sometime after 4 a.m. She was clammy, weak, but breathing easier. I wiped her face with a damp cloth warmed over the last cup of propane, then carried her upstairs and layered every remaining blanket on top of the sleeping bag. She slept hard, the sleep of someone whose body had fought a battle, and won for now. I stood at the bedroom window and looked down the slope. The lower development glittered like a toy village someone had shaken too hard. Portable generators hummed their exhaust plumes, rising straight up in the still air. Orange extension cords snaked across driveways to space heaters glowing in open garages. A white catering tent still stood in the middle of Heather Glen Lane, its sides flapping gently. They had coffee donuts, Wi-Fi, and a private plow that had cleared their streets twice while my driveway remained an unmarked white canyon. They were prepared, just not for the right disaster. I pulled on every layer I owned, slung my grandfather's old canvas field pack coiled 50 feet of climbing rope over my shoulder, and stepped out. The cold was different now, dry, sharp, almost clean. The snow crunched under my boots like broken glass. I followed the tree line up the ridge, moving slow, checking my bearings every 100 yards. The trail to the dam was invisible, under drifts, but I'd walked it since I was 12. Muscle memory doesn't freeze. 3/4 of a mile later, the dam appeared, a low, honest wall of 1950s concrete, half hidden by pine boughs bent double with snow. Nothing dramatic, no roaring waterfall, just a practical barrier built by men who understood that mountains shed water the way dogs shed fur. My grandfather's initials were still scratched into the coping stone near the maintenance shack. I brushed snow from them and felt the years collapse into a single moment. The control box was locked, but my key worked here too. Inside, the gears were stiff with cold but intact. The reservoir level gauge read higher than I'd ever seen it in winter ice, thick on top, but pressure building underneath. I turned the manual wheel, a cautious half rotation, just to confirm it still moved. A low metallic groan answered, followed by the faint muffled pop of ice shifting somewhere out on the frozen surface. Good. The system remembered how to speak. I closed the panel, latched it, and walked to the edge of the water. The ice was mottled gray and white with dark patches where melt had already begun beneath the surface. I tossed a fist-sized rock. It landed with a hollow thud and a faint echo, water moving under ice, impatient. Time and temperature were the only allies I needed now. As I turned to leave, headlights crawled up the maintenance road far below slow, deliberate four-wheel drive. I stepped behind a pine and watched. The vehicle crested the rise and stopped 20 yards away. White Escalade Ridge 1 plates caked in salt and mud. Karen got out alone. She wore a full-length coyote fur parka that probably cost more than my truck, but her face was bare cheeks red from wind and something else. She scanned the dam like she was looking for something she'd misplaced, then spotted me. Harlan, her voice cracked across the frozen air. I walked down the slope until 10 yards separated us, close enough to talk, far enough to keep the high ground. Morning, Karen. Little early for a site visit. She planted her boots wide the way people do when they're trying to look bigger than they feel. What exactly do you think you're doing up here? Checking infrastructure I own, I said. Same as always. You have no authority. Wrong. I pulled the folded deed from my inside pocket and held it up so the county seal caught the weak sunlight. This says I have sole authority over the spillway and all auxiliary controls, including this dam. County records confirm it. Your engineers forgot to mention that when they graded Phase 3. Her eyes flicked to the deed, then to the reservoir, then back to me. For the first time, the mask slipped completely. You're bluffing. Am I? I gestured at the ice. That crack you just heard? That's 36 inches of new snow sitting on a reservoir that's already over capacity. Warm front hits Tuesday. You know what happens then. She didn't answer. Water finds the path of least resistance, I continued. And thanks to your landscaping crew paving over the original drainage swales, the path of least resistance runs right under 15 foundations that never should have been poured. Her voice dropped to a hiss. If anything happens to those homes, I will bury you in court. You'll be too busy explaining forged elevation certificates to the county inspector. I already forwarded the originals, the ones you buried, to Aaron Bell, and 2 reporters. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might drop. You're insane, she whispered. No, Karen, I'm patient. There's a difference. A long, low crack rolled across the reservoir like distant thunder. Ice shifting. Water remembering. She jumped at the sound. I didn't. This isn't your fight anymore, I said quietly. It's gravity's. She stared at me for another 5 seconds, chest rising and falling too fast, then spun on her heel and marched back to the Escalade. The door slammed hard enough to echo. Tires spun caught, and she fishtailed down the road, disappearing in a cloud of powder. I stood there until the sound faded completely. Then I turned the wheel, another quarter turn, just enough to ease the pressure a hair more, and locked the panel. The dam didn't need sabotage. It only needed to stop being ignored. On the hike down, I passed the spillway hatch again. The aspen marker I'd planted still stood upright, a lone black slash against the white. I knelt, brushed fresh snow from the lid, and rested my bare hand on the cold metal for a moment. Soon I said to no one, or maybe to the water, or maybe to my grandfather. Then I hiked home through snow that already felt softer under my boots. The thaw was coming, and with it consequences long overdue. Tuesday came in like a thief. The cold didn't break with trumpets. It simply left. 1 hour the air was 20 below, the next it was 33 above and climbing. A warm wind rolled down from the Pacific, wet and heavy, the kind of wind that turns a fortress of snow into a crater overnight. By noon, the eaves were dripping in steady silver streams. By 2, the drifts along the driveway had collapsed into slush the color of dirty coffee. Inside the house, the temperature climbed past 50 for the first time in 9 days. Maggie was sitting up, color back in her cheeks, sipping broth and watching the water run in rivers off the roof. "Dad," she said quietly, "it sounds like spring." "It is," I answered. "Just not the kind they sell on postcards." I layered up one last time, not for cold now, but for what came next, and stepped outside. The valley had turned into a different planet. Snow sagged from the pines in wet, suicidal clumps. The creek behind the house roared, where yesterday it had been a polite trickle under ice. Every roof in sight shed its load in miniature avalanches that slammed to the ground with the dull thud of artillery. I walked the ridgeline trail again, boots punching through the crust into ankle-deep slush. The dam greeted me with a sound I'd never heard before, a low, continuous moan like a wounded animal trying to stand. Cracks zigzagged across the reservoir ice in lightning patterns. Dark water showed in the gaps, moving fast. The gauge inside the control box now sat in the red. I didn't touch the wheel. I didn't need to. Nature had taken the con. At 2:11 p.m., I reached the spillway hatch one final time. The aspen marker had fallen. The snow around the concrete lid was already melting into a perfect bowl. I knelt, fitted the key, and turned the wheel hard, 3 full rotations this time. The gear screamed, then gave way with a metallic shriek that echoed down the valley like a starting gun. The first rush was almost polite, a silver ribbon sliding over the lip of the channel, hissing as it met the frozen ground. Then the ice upstream cracked with a sound like a mortar round. A second thicker surge followed, carrying chunks of ice the size of microwaves. Within 30 seconds, the trickle became a raw brown water, foaming white at the edges, chewing the snowpack into submission as it carved its ancient path downhill. I stood back and watched the mountain take its payment. From my vantage, I could see the entire lower development spread out like a model on a table. At first, nothing changed. Then the leading edge of the water found the cul-de-sac on Heather Glen Lane. It slipped under decorative fencing curled around brand new retaining walls that had never been engineered for more than sprinkler runoff, and began to rise. Panic arrived in perfect stages. Stage 1, confusion. A man in a Patagonia vest stepped onto his front porch with a coffee mug, stared at the water licking his welcome mat, and laughed like it was a prank. Stage 2, realization. The same man dropped the mug, ceramic exploded on concrete, and started yelling for his wife. Stage 3, chaos. Car alarms began chirping as water found electrical systems. Garage doors tried to close on rising tides and jammed halfway. Someone fired up a pickup and attempted to ford the street. The truck lurched, stalled, and settled nose down in 2 feet of moving runoff. Dogs barked from second-story windows. Children cried. Portable generators coughed and drowned. I watched through binoculars as the water crept across perfect zoysia lawns, turning them into shallow lakes the color of weak tea. It rose over curb lines, poured into window wells, and found every illegal basement the builders had dug too deep to save a few bucks on fill dirt. And there, dead center of the cul-de-sac, stood Karen. She had come outside in bedroom slippers and a silk robe phone pressed to her ear, spinning in slow circles as if looking for someone to blame. Water lapped at her ankles, then her calves. She screamed into the phone. I didn't need to hear the words to know them. The flood never got more than 30 inches deep, not biblical, not cinematic, just steady, relentless, and utterly indifferent. Enough to ruin drywall short-circuit furnaces, turn leather sectionals into sponges. Enough to cost millions and void every insurance policy that had conveniently forgotten to mention known emergency spillway channel. At 3:07 p.m., The first county sheriff's SUV appeared at the top of the private road lights flashing, but nowhere to go. The HOA's own decorative gate now sat underwater. A deputy got out, stared at the scene, then looked up the hill straight at me. I lifted one hand in a lazy salute. He shook his head and reached for his radio. By 3:42, the news helicopters arrived. By 4:15, the HOA emergency text blast went out to every resident except me. Urgent, unexpected overflow event. Lower Phase 3 residents evacuate immediately. Investigation underway. Unexpected. I read it twice, then laughed out loud for the first time since the fire. The sound startled a raven off a nearby pine. It wheeled overhead, scolding me for disturbing the new order. I hiked home through air that smelled of mud and pine pitch and distant barbecue smoke from someone's drowned Weber. The creek beside the trail ran bank full and happy. My boots were soaked, my hands numb, but something heavy had lifted from my chest. Something I hadn't even realized was there, until it was gone. Maggie met me at the door, wrapped in a blanket, eyes bright. "It's on TV," she said. "They're calling it the Valentine's Day flood." I looked past her to the living room window. From our elevation, the lower cul-de-sac looked like a shallow lake, reflecting the late sun, toy houses sitting in it, like someone had overfilled a bathtub. "Turn it off," I said gently. "We've seen enough." She did. Then she hugged me so hard I felt her heartbeat through all the layers. "Is it over?" she whispered. "No," I said. "But the hard part is..." Outside, the water kept moving, patient and thorough, washing away illusions, one expensive square foot at a time. And for the first time in months, the house felt truly deeply warm. Not from the stove, but from the simple ancient knowledge that some things cannot be fined, voted on, or burned. Some things answer only to gravity time. And a man who was finally done asking permission. The water never left dramatically. It simply refused to leave at all. By Wednesday morning, the temperature had climbed into the low 40s and stayed there, a wet, relentless warmth that turned the entire lower development into a shallow, muddy lake. Pumps arrived, big diesel beasts rented at triple overtime, but every gallon they sucked out was replaced by another gallon seeping from the saturated hillside. The original emergency channel, ignored for years, had reasserted itself with the quiet confidence of something that was never actually gone. News vans lined the county road by 8. Drones buzzed overhead like angry hornets. A reporter from Channel 8 stood knee-deep in runoff hair plastered to her forehead, gesturing at a half-submerged Mercedes whose alarm had been wailing for 16 straight hours. Sources tell us the flooding may be linked to the activation of a little-known emergency spillway dating back to the 1950s, a structure whose legal control appears to rest with a single private landowner. They showed drone footage, the perfect rectangle of Phase 3, now a coffee-colored mirror, water lapping at garage doors, reflective tape on abandoned BMWs, blinking like lost buoys. Then they cut to file photos of Karen Stratton at last year's charity gala, smiling in diamonds and champagne. The Chiron read, HOA president under fire, as Valentine's flood exposes illegal construction. By noon, the county inspector Aaron Bell, the same man who'd dismissed my complaints 6 months earlier, arrived with a convoy of trucks and a face the color of spoiled milk. He waded through the mess with a metal detector and a clipboard measuring elevations, taking core samples, and growing paler with every reading. Someone had already spray-painted across the model home garage, in dripping red letters, "Floodplain, Ill Truth." Jeff showed up at my door at 2:17 p.m., soaked to the thighs, glasses fogged, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years overnight. "Can I come in?" he asked. His voice cracked on the last word. I stepped aside. He stood dripping on the mat, staring at the floor. "Karen's in hiding. Lawyers told her not to speak. The board's emergency vote is tonight. We're dissolving the current leadership." I poured him coffee he didn't drink. "You knew," I said, "not a question." He nodded, miserable. "Not the arson. God, no. But the permits. She said the engineers fixed the elevation issue. Said the spillway was decommissioned. We voted to approve Phase 3 because the budget was underwater, and she promised the sale proceeds would bail us out." He finally looked up. "We were idiots." "Yes," I said. "You were." He flinched. "The insurance companies are already denying claims. They found the original floodplain maps in the county archives, the ones we never filed. Homeowners are lawyering up. Against us." I handed him a towel. He took it like a surrender flag. "What do you want, Harlan?" he whispered. I thought of Maggie asleep upstairs, finally warm, finally safe. I want to split wood without being photographed. I want my daughter to grow up without looking over her shoulder for the next violation notice. I want Karen gone. Permanently. Jeff swallowed. She's gone. Left for Arizona at 5 this morning. Took what she could carry. He set the untouched coffee on the counter. We're voting tonight to suspend all fines, dissolve the architectural committee, and turn over every document to the county. Whatever's left of the HOA will be a shell until the audits finish. He hesitated at the door. I'm sorry about the shed, about all of it. I didn't answer. Some apologies are too late to matter. After he left, I walked down to the edge of my property and watched the pumps work. Men in chest waders dragged extension cords through the mud like orange intestines. A flatbed arrived to haul away the drowned Mercedes. The winch screamed as it dragged the car up the ramp, water pouring from every seam like tears. At 6:03 p.m., my phone buzzed with a new county alert. Emergency HOA meeting, 7:00 p.m. All residents encouraged to attend. Topic: dissolution of current board and full cooperation with investigations. I didn't go. I'd already attended every meeting that mattered. Instead, I fired up the chainsaw for the first time since the fire dropped a dead standing pine at the back of the lot and spent the evening bucking it into rounds. The smell of fresh pine sap and two-stroke exhaust filled the air like incense. Maggie sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunset over a valley that finally looked honest again, scarred, muddy reels. At 9:42 p.m., Jeff texted a single photo, the community center room packed shoulder to shoulder, Karen's chair empty, emotion on the screen in bold letters. Motion to remove Karen Stratton as president. Effective immediately, unanimous. Below it, a second motion. Motion to suspend all outstanding fines and violations pending full audit, also unanimous. I showed the phone to Maggie. She read it, then leaned her head against my shoulder. Think it's really over? She asked. No, I said, stacking another round on the chopping block. But the part where they get to hurt us, that's done. We worked until full dark, the two of us splitting and stacking new wood under the security light. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in 2 years walked past on the road, slowed, nodded. Some stopped entirely. One man, the same one who'd once complained about my eyesore shed, set a bundle of split kindling on the tailgate of my truck without a word and kept walking. By midnight, we had 2 full cords neatly ranked where the old shed used to stand. The moon came out cold and bright, turning the floodwater below into hammered silver. Maggie went inside first. I stayed out a little longer, running my hand over the fresh-cut faces of the logs, feeling the grain, the weight, the promise. Somewhere down the hill, a pump engine sputtered and died. Somewhere farther still, a woman who used to rule this valley was driving south on an interstate, watching Montana shrink in her rearview mirror. And up here, high on the ridge my grandfather had claimed, before any of them ever dreamed of cul-de-sacs and covenants, a father and his daughter stacked wood that would burn clean and hot for a long time to come. The water had spoken. The mountain had listened. And for the first time in years, the night sounded like peace. They came for me on the first day of March when the snow was finally gone from the valley floor and the mud had hardened enough to drive on. 2 certified letters arrived at once, delivered by a deputy who looked embarrassed to be there. Envelope 1, civil complaint. Ridgeview Heights, HOA v. Harlan case, number 25 CV 147. Damages sought, $42 million. Counts: malicious flooding, intentional infliction of emotional distress, nuisance, defamation, environmental, terrorism. Envelope 2, notice of emergency injunction hearing, March 5, 9:00 a.m. Judge Dana Corrigan presiding. I carried both inside, laid them on the kitchen table next to the new binder, this one labeled counterclaim and called Ben Keating. He was at the house in under 2 hours boots, still carrying Red Canyon dust from another fight in Bozeman. He spread the complaint across the table like a crime scene photo and started laughing low, delighted, dangerous. They're suing you for opening a spillway you legally control on land they illegally built on after they torched your winter fuel supply in sub-zero weather. He wiped his eyes. This isn't a lawsuit, Harlan. It's a suicide note. We spent the next 72 hours weaponizing every scrap of paper either of us had ever touched. Drone footage from the county GIS office, time-stamped, showing water following the exact pre-construction floodway. The original 1957 deed with the Spillway clause circled in red. The forged elevation certificates Karen had submitted metadata proved they were created 3 months after my first objection. Every violation notice, every fine, every email I'd ever sent warning them. The fire marshal's report listing arson as the official cause. The porch camera stills of the 2 hooded figures and the red gas can. A sworn affidavit from the young woman whose porch paint had been found same color as Karen's house receipts attached. Ben added his own landmines depositions from 2 former board members who'd rolled over the minute subpoenas landed, plus the smoking gun, an email chain where Karen instructed the landscaping contractor to delete the old floodplain layer from the site plan. Nobody will notice. By the time we walked into the Lewis and Clark County Courthouse on March 5th, the HOA's legal team looked like men who'd just realized they brought knives to a gunfight. Judge Dana Corrigan was 60 sharp and famously allergic to bullshit. She took one look at the packed gallery. Half the valley had shown up in Carhartt and flannel and banged the gavel before anyone sat down. Counsel, I've read the filings. I've read the counterfilings. And I've read the county floodplain maps from 1957-1991 and the ones mysteriously absent from the plaintiff's permit package. Somebody start talking before I start sanctioning. The HOA's lead attorney, a tall kid from Billings in a $3,000 suit and visible panic, tried the rogue homeowner narrative. He lasted 4 minutes. Ben stood up, clicked the remote, and the big screen behind him lit up with drone footage of water flowing in a perfect blue arrow straight through Phase 3. Objection, Your Honor. Facts. Corrigan's mouth twitched. Overruled. Keep going, Mr. Keating. Ben walked them through it like a battlefield debrief. The spillway activation was legal, documented, and necessary. Phase 3 was built in a mapped emergency discharge zone. The HOA had notice multiple times in writing. The arson preceded the flood by 9 days. The plaintiff's own president had falsified documents and fled the jurisdiction. When he played the porch camera clip enhanced, slowed, zoomed on the gas can, the gallery actually gasped. The attorney tried to object again. Corrigan shut him down with a look that could freeze gasoline. At 11:47 a.m., she ruled from the bench. Case dismissed with prejudice. Costs and attorney fees to the defendant. Furthermore, the court is referring this matter to the county attorney for potential criminal investigation into arson insurance fraud and filing false instruments. Bailiff Calendar A sanctions hearing against plaintiff's counsel for bringing a frivolous suit. Karen's lawyer went the color of old snow. We walked out into sunlight that felt like the first honest day of spring. The cameras were waiting on the courthouse steps. I started to push past, but Ben grabbed my arm. Let them have it, he murmured. One soundbite, clean, then we're done. A reporter shoved a mic forward. Mr. Harlan, do you consider this revenge? I looked straight into the lens. No, ma'am, I consider it physics. That clip ran statewide for a week. 2 days later, the county condemned all of Phase 3. Bulldozers arrived before the mud dried. The houses came down faster than they went up roof trusses, dropping like broken toys, vinyl siding peeled off in long, wounded strips. The scar that was left behind looked exactly like the original floodplain on my grandfather's 1957 map. Insurance companies denied every claim. Lawsuits flew in 17 directions at once. The HOA dissolved itself in April, replaced by a bare-bones maintenance group whose only job was to keep the roads plowed and stay the hell out of people's lives. Karen never came back. Rumor said she was living in a condo outside Phoenix under her maiden name, selling real estate to snowbirds who'd never heard of Montana. I never bothered to check. Spring turned into summer. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years started showing up with chainsaws and strong backs. We poured a new concrete slab where the old shed had burned, framed the walls higher, ran real wiring and insulation thick enough to laugh at 50 below. By August, the new shed stood taller, straighter, and someone hung a hand-painted sign above the door. Harlan and Daughter's Outpost. If you can see it, it's here to keep us alive. Maggie painted the letters herself. One Saturday in September, a county truck rolled up the driveway. 2 men in hard hats got out, asked permission politely, and welded a shiny new county seal over the old spillway hatch. Then they handed me a plaque on a cedar post. Emergency Spillway. Private Stewardship. In grateful recognition of responsible management, February 2025, Lewis and Clark County Commission. I drove the post into the ground myself right beside the hatch. That night, Maggie and I sat on the porch with bowls of ice cream and watched heat lightning flicker over the mountains. The air smelled of cut hay and wood smoke from someone's first fire of the season. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. I looked at the new shed, glowing under its own light, at the stacks of seasoned birch taller than the roofline at the quiet valley that finally looked like it belonged to the people who lived in it instead of the people who tried to rule it. "No," I said. "This is where we plant our flag." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "Good," she whispered, "because I'm never letting another clipboard near this house." We finished our ice cream in silence, listening to the crickets and the soft creak of new lumber settling into place. Winter would come again. It always does. But this time, when it slammed the door, we'd be ready. And the mountain, quiet, ancient, and finally at peace, would be ready too. October again. A year almost to the day since Karen Stratton first rolled up my driveway with her clipboard and her 4-inch smile. The aspen had turned gold and were already shedding leaves like slow-motion confetti. The new shed stood proud at the back of the lot, 20 by 24 steel roof double doors wide enough for the tractor walls wrapped in so much insulation you could stand inside naked in January and feel nothing but smug. 4 full cords were already ranked along the north wall ends painted blue, so we'd know which wood had cured longest. Maggie had insisted on the color, said it reminded her of the sky the morning the water finally left. We had chickens now, 6 Rhode Island Reds, and 1 bossy rooster named Justice. The coop sat where the propane enclosure used to be, bright red with white trim, and a hand-painted sign Maggie made in shop class, "Eggs and Attitude, Inquire Within." Neighbors stopped by most afternoons with coffee or beer, or just curiosity. Some still apologized with their eyes. I let them. Forgiveness isn't a speech. It's a quiet nod and an offer to help carry another log. The county had finished its last audit in July. The final report was 187 pages and read like a crime novel. Karen Stratton was named in 12 counts of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The Attorney General in Helena took the file, thanked the county politely, and opened a criminal case. She never showed for the arraignment. A bench warrant still floats somewhere over the desert between here and Phoenix. Phase 3 is gone entirely now. Where 15 spec houses once sat, there's only a wide, grassy swale that floods every spring and dries into a meadow of fireweed and lupine by August. The county planted willows along the new banks and put up a little bronze plaque near the entrance road, "Restored Floodplain 2025," dedicated to the citizens who reminded us that water always wins. I pass it every time I drive to town. I never slow down, but I always tip 2 fingers off the steering wheel in salute. One evening in late October, I came home from splitting kindling to find a plain white envelope on the porch mat. No stamp, no return address, just my name and handwriting I hadn't seen in a year. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table beside the new stove, a Jotel cast-iron beast Maggie picked out herself, and stared at it for a long time. The house smelled of venison stew, simmering, and fresh coffee. Justice the rooster crowed once outside, indignant about something only he understood. Maggie walked in, hair tied back, cheeks flushed from feeding the chickens. "What's that?" "A ghost," I said. She read my face, nodded once, and left me alone with it. I slit the envelope with my pocket knife. 1 sheet, 1 line, same manicured cursive. "You were right. I was wrong." I read it twice. Then I carried it to the stove, opened the door, and watched the paper curl, blacken, and disappear up the flue in a brief orange dance. The flames took it without hesitation. Some things are meant to become heat and nothing more. Maggie came back in as the last ash drifted out of sight. "Everything okay?" "Everything's perfect," I said. She studied me a moment, then smiled the slow, knowing smile that told me she was growing into a woman who would never need rescuing again. "Good," she said, "because the neighbors are coming over. Potluck. They want to toast the new shed and the fact that nobody's gotten a violation notice in 6 months." I laughed, actually laughed, and pulled 2 bowls from the cupboard. "Tell them to bring chairs. And pie. Definitely pie." They started arriving at dusk, the young couple who'd been fined for their porch color, the retired teacher who once signed Karen's petitions, the contractor who'd refused to build the privacy fence and lost the HOA contract for it. Coolers, folding tables, lanterns strung from the rafters of the new shed, like Christmas in October. Someone fired up a portable speaker and played Old Johnny Cash. Someone else produced a bottle of 20-year Pappy Van Winkle they claimed had been waiting for the right night. We ate elk chili and cornbread under strings of Edison bulbs, told stories we were finally able to laugh about, and watched the stars come out one by one until the sky looked like spilled diamonds. The kids chased fireflies that had shown up early. The dogs wrestled in the grass. Justice the rooster crowed at the moon and was universally ignored. At some point, Maggie climbed onto a hay bale with a mason jar of cider and raised it high. To Dad, she said simply, "Who taught us that sometimes the only way to stay warm is to let the water run where it was always meant to?" Every jar bottle and red Solo cup went up. Someone started clapping. Then everyone was clapping. I stood there in the middle of it all, throat-tight, eyes stinging from wood smoke or something else, and realized this was what victory actually feels like, not the absence of enemies, but the presence of people who finally see you. Later, when the fire in the pit had burned down to coals and most of the neighbors had wandered home, under a frost-tipped moon, Maggie and I sat on the porch steps, sharing the last of the cider. She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was small enough to carry. "Think winter will be easier this year." I looked at the shed, glowing softly under its own light, at the neat walls of wood that would outlast both of us, at the quiet valley that had finally remembered its own name. "Winter will be winter," I said. "Cold as hell and twice as mean. But we'll be warm." She was quiet for a long time. "Good," she whispered, "because I like it here." I put my arm around her and pulled her close. "Me too, kid, me too." Somewhere far below, the restored floodplain caught the moonlight in a long silver ribbon that used to be a cul-de-sac. Willows rustled along the banks. An owl called once, then thought better of it. The mountain was quiet. The water was quiet. And for the first time in my life, so was Reese Harlan. Winter would come again. It always does. But when it slams the door this time, it will find a house full of light, a shed full of wood, and a family that no longer has to ask permission to survive. Some fires are lit for warmth. Some are lit for war. And some, just some, are lit to watch the last ghost of a bad year curl into smoke and disappear forever. That night, we fed the stove one more log, closed the door, and let the flames do what they do best. Turn the past into heat, and keep the future bright.